3 days after they cracked open my chest, I stood at the hospital entrance in a paper-thin discharge gown and a pair of socks someone had left in my room, and I realized my daughter wasn't coming. I'd called 4 times, straight to voicemail. The fifth time, I got a message I'd never seen before on my phone. This number is not accepting calls from your number. She'd blocked me. My own daughter had blocked me while I was still wearing a hospital bracelet. The nurse at the front desk, a young woman named Amy with tired eyes and a kind voice, asked if I needed her to call someone. I told her no. I don't know why I said that. Pride, maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to say out loud that there was no one to call. My son-in-law's name was Brett. I want you to remember that name. He'll come up again. I live in a small house in Kenosha, Wisconsin, about 32 miles from the hospital in Racine. 32 miles doesn't sound like much until you're 64 years old. Your sternum is held together by wire sutures, and the balance in your checking account is 43 17s. The cab app on my phone quoted me $58 to get home. I sat down on a bench outside the emergency entrance. It was February, not the kind of February that looks pretty on greeting cards. The kind where the wind comes off Lake Michigan like it's trying to settle a personal grudge. I sat there for a while, and I just thought about how I'd ended up here. My wife, Loretta, passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer, caught too late. After she died, my daughter was the only family I had left. We'd been close. I thought we'd been close. I coached her softball team when she was 9. I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot at the Kmart off Highway 50 on a Saturday morning. I walked her down the aisle at her wedding 11 years ago, and I cried so hard during the father-daughter dance that the DJ actually stopped and checked on me. Then Brett came into the picture more completely. That's the only way I can describe it. He'd always been there, but after Loretta died, something shifted. Slowly at first. My daughter started canceling Sunday dinners. Then the calls got shorter. Then they stopped initiating altogether, and I was always the one dialing. Last Christmas I drove 40 minutes to bring a ham and a pie, and they weren't home. No call, no note on the door, just a dark house. When I had my cardiac event in January, a blocked artery, the doctor said I was lucky I came in when I did. I called my daughter from the ER. She answered that time. She said she'd be there. She wasn't. So that February afternoon I sat on that bench outside Racine Medical Center, and I tried to do the math on whether I could walk 32 miles in February 14 days post-open heart surgery. I decided I probably could not. And that's when a man sat down next to me. He was maybe 40, 45, wearing a long wool coat and carrying a leather bag. He had the kind of face that looks like it's seen things and made peace with most of them. He glanced at me, then at my hospital bracelet, then at my socks. He said, "You need a ride?" I said, "I'm fine." He said, "You're sitting outside a hospital in socks." I looked down. He had a point. His name was Leonard Webb. He told me he was a principal, had been for 11 years, at a high school up in Sheboygan. He'd been at the hospital visiting a colleague who'd had a hip replacement. He was about to drive back north and said Kenosha was right on his way, more or less. I almost said no again. I am a man who has spent 64 years saying no to help he needed. But something about the cold and the socks and the 43.17 nuns in my account made me say yes. In the car, he asked me how I was doing. I said fine. He asked again, differently, the way people do when they mean it. And I don't know what happened. Maybe it was the medication, maybe it was the 6 days alone in that hospital room, maybe it was the fact that my daughter had blocked my number. I just started talking. I told him about Loretta, about my daughter, about Brett, about the dark house at Christmas, about the bench. He didn't say much. He listened the way people used to listen before everyone had a phone in their hand. When I finally ran out of words somewhere around the Racine County line, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I grew up with a father who felt invisible too. It does something to a man." I asked him what his father had done about it. He said, he found better people to be around. Took him a while, but he did. We pulled up to my house on Birchwood Avenue. He helped me to the door, insisted on it, wouldn't take no for an answer. I thanked him. He gave me his card and said to call if I needed anything. I thanked him again and went inside and put his card in the drawer next to the phone where I put things I don't think I'll use. That night, I ate a can of soup and went to bed and tried not to think about my daughter. Here's something I've never told anyone. 31 years ago, I was a shop teacher at Jefferson Middle School in Kenosha. I was 33 years old. Loretta and I had a 2-year-old at home, and I was working a second job at a hardware store on weekends to keep up with the mortgage. We were not poor, but we were close enough to it that I understood the distance. One October, a boy came into my classroom after school. Thin kid, quiet, always sat in the back. His name was, well, I'll call him what everyone called him, which was Leo. He was 14. He stood in the doorway of my shop classroom and asked if he could talk to me about something. I said sure. He sat down on a stool across from my workbench, and he told me he'd been accepted to a summer engineering program at Marquette University. Full program, but there was a registration fee, $200, that his family couldn't cover. He'd been trying to raise the money doing odd jobs, but he was $80 short, and the deadline was in 3 days. I remember thinking about the $80. I remember doing the math in my head, what $80 meant that particular week. I remember deciding it didn't matter. I went to my truck and got my wallet, and I gave him 4 20s from the emergency cash I kept in there. I told him to pay it forward someday if he ever got the chance. He looked at the money for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "Why?" I said, "Because someone should." He went to that program. I know because he came back in September and left a thank you card on my desk. I don't remember what it said. I remember the handwriting was careful and deliberate, like he'd practiced it. Then he moved away with his family, and I didn't think about him again for 31 years. I was home for about 2 weeks before I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Sheboygan area code. It was Leonard. He said he'd been thinking about me. He asked how I was recovering. I told him the truth. Not great. The house felt big. The nights felt long. I was having trouble with the stairs. He asked if I had anyone helping me with meals, with the physical therapy exercises the hospital had assigned. I told him I was managing. There was a pause, and then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to not say no before you think about it." He wanted me to come stay at his house in Sheboygan for a few weeks. He had a guest room on the ground floor, no stairs. His wife, Pauline, was a physical therapist, retired now but still sharp. He said it would just be until I was steady enough to be on my own. I started to say no. He said, "You sat outside a hospital in February in socks. Please don't tell me you're managing." I laughed. I hadn't laughed in a while. I noticed the feeling of it, the way you notice something you've been missing. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I packed a bag and drove up to Sheboygan. Leonard and Pauline lived in a house that felt lived in the way only good houses do. Books on every flat surface, a dog that moved slow but followed you from room to room, a kitchen that always seemed to have something on the stove. Pauline had me doing range of motion exercises within the first 48 hours. She was gentle about it, but firm. She reminded me of Loretta, a little. Not in how she looked, but in how she didn't take excuses from people she was trying to help. One evening after dinner, probably the third or fourth night I was there, Leonard and I were sitting on his back porch with decaf coffee, watching the yard go dark. He said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone I just met?" I said he could. He said, "When I was 14, a teacher gave me $80 he didn't have to give. I was trying to get to a summer engineering program at Marquette. The registration fee was $200. I was $80 short. I went very still," he said. "His name was Mr. Aldrich. He taught shop class. He had a short gray beard and drove a blue Ford truck, and he told me to pay it forward someday." The coffee cup in my hand felt very heavy. I said, "What did you do with that $80? He smiled. He said, "I went to that program, and then I went to college. And then I got a master's degree, and then I became a teacher, and then I became a principal. And I have spent 31 years trying to do for other people what that man did for me." I couldn't speak. I'm not someone who loses words easily. I've been talking to teenagers for decades. But I sat there on that porch in Sheboygan with decaf coffee going cold in my hand, and I could not find a single word. Leonard looked at me for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "It's you, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. I said, "Leo." He said, "Nobody's called me that since 7th grade." We sat with that for a while. The dog came and put his head on my knee. The yard got darker. At some point, Pauline came to the door and looked at us and seemed to understand that something important was happening, and went back inside without saying anything. Finally, Leonard said, "I have been trying to find Mr. Aldrich for 15 years. I tried everything. School records, social media, old colleagues. I thought maybe he'd moved away or he stopped." I said, "I'm here." He said, "Yeah." He laughed a little, and his eyes were wet. "You're here. I want to tell you about my daughter. Not because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm past that, but because it's part of the story." 3 weeks into my stay in Sheboygan, I got a call, a different number this time. She'd gotten a new phone, apparently. She was polite in a careful way that told me Brett was nearby. She said she'd heard I had surgery. She asked how I was. I said I was staying with friends up north. She asked which friends. I said it was someone I knew. She didn't push. She said they should get together sometime. I said sure. Then she said Brett had been talking, and they'd both been thinking, and they wondered if I'd given any thought to. And here she paused in a way that made me brace myself, getting my affairs in order, my will, my house. She said she didn't want to be morbid, but she thought it was something to consider. I was 64 and recovering from open heart surgery, and my daughter had called, first call in 2 months, to ask about my will. I said I'd think about it. Then I hung up and sat on the guest room bed for a long time. That evening, I told Leonard. He listened. He didn't say much, except at the end he said, "People show you who they are. The hard thing is believing them the first time." I said I thought I'd been a good father. He said he thought I probably had been. He said good fathers sometimes raised people who still made their own bad choices. I said I'd never stop trying. He said, "I know. I can see it on you. But trying isn't the same as owing." That stayed with me. Over the following weeks I recovered. Slowly, then more quickly. Pauline had me walking a mile by week 3. By week 5 I was doing the full physical therapy routine without assistance. Leonard and I fell into a rhythm. Morning coffee, long talks in the evening, occasional drives out past the lake on weekends. He was a reader, like I was. We'd go to the library on Saturday mornings and come back with snacks. His school was on spring break during my 5th week, and he took a few days off to just be around. We drove up to Door County one afternoon, just to drive. We talked about Loretta, about his father, who died when Leonard was in graduate school, about what it meant to build a life that was worth something after the people who were supposed to be there weren't. He told me about a student he'd worked with for 3 years, a kid from a rough situation on the east side of Sheboygan, father in prison, mother working 2 jobs. Leonard had mentored him, advocated for him, helped him get into a college prep program. Kid was now at UW-Madison on scholarship. Leonard talked about it the way I used to talk about a student who finally got a wood joint right. Not proud of himself, exactly. More like satisfied that the thing worked out the way it was supposed to. I thought about that a lot, about what it means to choose your life's work that way, to invest in people who aren't your family and aren't going to make you rich, and might not even remember you later. I'd done that for 30 years in a classroom. And somehow in those 30 years I'd let myself believe that my daughter was the main thing, the thing that made it all add up. And she'd turned off her phone. Leonard never said that directly. But I think he knew I was working through it. By the time I was ready to go back to Kenosha, something had shifted. My daughter called again a week before I left. Brett was not nearby this time. I could tell by the way her voice was different, less careful. She said she was sorry she'd been distant. She said Brett had, and here she paused again differently this time, strong opinions about things that she'd been going along with. She said she didn't know how to explain it. She said she missed me. I didn't rush to forgive her. I want to be honest about that. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, not yet. But I told her I was glad she called. I told her I'd be back in Kenosha in a week. I said we could get lunch if she wanted. She showed up. We sat in a booth at a diner on 52nd Street, the one Loretta and I used to take her to on Sunday mornings when she was small. She ordered the same thing she always did as a kid, pancakes with blueberries, which made me smile even though I was trying to be careful. We talked for 2 hours. She cried once. I didn't, but it was a near thing. She told me Brett had controlled more of their life than she'd admitted to anyone. She was in therapy now, had been for 3 months. She was working things out. I told her I was glad, and I meant it. I didn't tell her about Leonard, not that day. That felt like something I needed to hold for a little while longer. Here is what I know, 64 years into being alive. Kindness is not a transaction. You don't put it somewhere and wait for a return. You do it because it's the right thing to do in that moment, and then you let it go. That's it. That's the whole thing. But sometimes, not always, not reliably, not in a way you can count on or plan for. It comes back, not as repayment, more like an echo. You send something out into the world, and 31 years later it comes back to you on a February afternoon in a hospital parking lot, in the form of a man with kind eyes and a wool coat who noticed your socks. Leonard and I talk every week now. He's called me his honorary uncle. I've called him my improbable son. Pauline makes fun of us both. The dog has started sitting between us when we're on the porch, like he's decided we're a pack now. My daughter and I are finding our way back to each other. slowly. "The way you rebuild something that got damaged. You don't pretend it didn't crack. You just work carefully around the cracks until they become part of the structure. Brett is gone, as it happens. She asked him to leave in March. I don't feel triumphant about that. I feel relieved for her. My house on Birchwood Avenue has a bird feeder in the front yard now, which Pauline sent me in the mail with a note that said, 'For when the mornings are long.' I fill it every Sunday. A few months after I got home, I went back to the community college in Kenosha. I volunteer there now, on Tuesday afternoons, in the vocational tech program. There are kids in there who remind me of 14-year-old Leo, quiet, trying hard, short on luck and resources. Sometimes a kid comes to me with a problem that $80 would solve, sometimes $120. I'm not a rich man, I never will be, but I know something now that I wish I'd known how to say out loud 31 years ago, when I handed a thin boy 420s in a shop classroom in October. I know that the smallest things you do, the things that feel almost too small to matter, sometimes turn out to be the whole story. I know that family is not always blood, and that blood is not always family. And I know that sitting on a bench in February in a pair of hospital socks, I was 2 minutes from walking 32 miles home alone, when the thing I'd done right in 1993 sat down next to me in a wool coat and asked if I needed a ride. I did, and for the first time in a long time I said yes.